Invasions of Privacy in Social Science Research, Ch7PrivacyPinkard. The Pinkard article is essentially a sort of recapping of the argument we had in the previous article. That would be the article by Parent on the importance of privacy. In the case of Pinkard's article, though, he wants to apply it to the social science field and social science research. So, much like Parent, Pinkard wants to go first and ask what the nature of the right and the nature of the right of privacy is. Once he's got an idea of what rights are generally and what the right to privacy is, he says, when is it justifiable to invade one's privacy? And so he also wants to put forth criteria that tell you when it's right or wrong to violate one's privacy. And then he wants to look at social science research in particular and ask, are the types of things that historically have been done in social science research, the sorts of information that's been gathered and the way it's been gathered, are those methods actually violating an individual's right to privacy, or the individuals who partake of the study? Are those studies violating their privacy? Rights and obligations. In the previous slide, I gave the example of a property right. There are two types of rights, and a property right falls into one of these two categories, namely a negative right. So rights and obligations come in two types. So to claim that one has a right entails that someone else has either a positive or negative obligation. So we mentioned that in the previous slide. So what sort of obligations might I have? Well, if I have a positive obligation, then it means I have an obligation to provide somebody with X or the means to do X. So to say I have a right to X sometimes means that somebody has to provide that to me. So you might say, for instance, that everyone has a right to at least a secondary education. Or maybe that's more controversial. Maybe I should say everyone has a right to a primary or elementary education. Well, what does that mean? Well, if it simply meant that you can't interfere with me getting an education, then that would be it. You can't bar me from going to school, say, or block the door. You'd be violating my right to an education. But I think most of us think that that's not what we mean when we say someone has a right to an education. To say that someone has a right to an education implies or entails that someone else has an obligation to provide that education. So if we say all children have a right to an education, what we mean is society or a particular city or a number of cities together combined have an obligation to provide the building and the teachers and so forth. That's a positive obligation. So to claim a right to an education is normally something attribute with a positive obligation on someone else. Negative obligations follow from negative rights claims. So a negative obligation is an obligation to refrain from interfering with someone else's doing or having X. So in the bag example, that was a sort of classic case of a negative obligation. To say that I own my bag, that I have a right to my bag, entails that you and everyone else has an obligation not to take my bag, not to sell my bag, not to use my bag, or destroy my bag without my permission. So a negative obligation means simply hands off, a non-interference. Sometimes negative rights are called non-interference rights. Now the general point Pinkard here, or is going to make here in the article, is that privacy is one of those sort of negative rights. In other words, I don't have to provide you with some sphere of privacy in the same way, like I have to actually construct a private area. But when I make a privacy claim, essentially what I'm making is the claim that others have obligations not to invade or interfere with a particular area of my life. So he wants to just make clear that when we're talking about rights, first of all, what is a right? It's sort of a justified claim to having something X, whatever X may be. And these rights come in two sorts, positive and negative. For our purposes here, we're going to look at privacy as essentially, or at least in most cases, as a negative sort of right, or a right that entails negative obligations. Privacy and respect for persons. As with Parent's article, Pinkard gives a similar analysis of the importance of privacy as related to the needs of the individual. Individual autonomy, if we hold this as a value, and I think most of us do hold this as a value, means that each of us are capable on acting and forming conceptions of the good life. So individual autonomy holds that I am a rational agent capable of deciding how I want to live my life, and others shouldn't interfere with that. And as Pinkard notes, it is surely a truism that control over one's life entails control to some degree over what is known by others about oneself and control over some set of crucial private areas of one's life. So privacy is important in part because as I'm forming my conception of the good life, I want to be free to experiment in different ways of living. I want to be able to pursue certain ends that I may reject later without the criticism of others. So I shouldn't be required, or it shouldn't be the case that others may come into my life and know all the things that I know, or at least know what my goals are at any given time. I should be able to make mistakes. I shouldn't be embarrassed by others or have to deal with the disapproval of others, assuming, of course, that what it is I'm doing, the sort of good life I'm going after, isn't interfering with someone else, but assuming that I'm simply trying out different ways of life, means that I shouldn't be under the microscope of others. So a general moral principle is a general respect. This general moral principle he's putting forth here is a respect for persons. And that respect for persons entails some sort of abstract right to privacy. To truly figure out what I want to do with my life, what I do need is some degree of privacy. I need the ability to look at various options without feeling the pressure of other individuals. Justifying invasions of privacy. While Pinkard holds that privacy is important just generally to all individuals as a fundamental respect of their personhood, of their autonomy, and their rationality, he's more interested in looking at invasions of privacy in the context of social science research. What interests Pinkard is the problems that accompany all sort of social science research, since some form of deception is required to form such experiments. One experiment mentioned in your book, actually one of the study questions, is for many of you possibly, if you've taken psychology, the famous Milgram studies or experiments. Stanley Milgram was a social science researcher that wanted to see how far individuals could be compelled to follow orders, even when those orders were morally sort of repugnant. So the Milgram experiment, you can read it in your text in Chapter 5 in the study question section. But to summarize it, Milgram essentially did the following. He got a number of volunteers to come in to act as electroshock givers, I guess would be the best way to put it. So what they had was there was the two-way mirror, and they had someone behind the mirror that couldn't see the person administering the shock. And the person administering the shock was told the following. The person in there, they were doing a study on behavioralism and seeing whether negative reinforcement would increase a subject's memory. So the research assistants, these people that had come in, they were told to do the following. Whenever the person behind the glass got the wrong answer, you were to administer a light shock. Every time they got a succeeding incorrect answer, you were to increase the amount of voltage going to the subject. So the first wrong answer would have a very mild shock, the second one slightly higher, and so forth and so on. And what was interesting is what Milgram found is that even when the people administering the shocks were told, look, here's the danger level. We can keep increasing the shocks, but once we get to this point, there's a danger level. Most people, at the command of the researcher, would continue to administer the shock even up to the point of the danger level. Now, it turns out that what Milgram was actually doing was not checking for memory under negative reinforcement. And in fact, the participants who were receiving the shocks weren't actually receiving the shock. There was an indicator, a light that only they could see, and they would pretend to be getting a shock. So they would know when the voltage was being increased. They would respond as if they were getting more and more voltage. But what was interesting is that in order to do this experiment, those who were administering the shock, who had been told that they were coming in to perform in one aspect of the experiment, were actually the subject of the experiment. And several people said this was an unnecessary invasion of privacy. After all, we've known about people following orders, even things that are morally repugnant, since the Holocaust. But others have argued that this is a necessary means of doing studies in social science research. And so the question is, does this violate the subject's privacy? When those subjects were asked to administer the shock, were they revealing information about themselves, how susceptible they are to suggestion, or how much they would follow orders? Is this something, is this information that the researcher had no right to get from them in this way, to deceive them in order to get? Criteria for determining unjust invasions of privacy. Essentially, what Pinkard does in his article is give us a couple of definitions of unjust invasions of privacy and ask whether or not these sort of work as a means of defining the realm in which social scientists may work. So the first criteria one, social scientists unjustifiably invade their subjects' privacy whenever they manipulate subjects into doing something embarrassing or disclosing private embarrassing facts, and thereby place their subjects in a false public light or intrude into their private domain. According to Pinkard, this criteria for determining unjust invasions of privacy is far too strict. On this account, if we really think about what this says, social scientists unjustifiably invade their subjects' privacy whenever they manipulate subjects into doing something embarrassing or disclosing private and embarrassing facts. Well, if it's whenever they manipulate subjects at all, if they keep any information, they do anything that brings out this information, it seems that no social science research would be possible. As Pinkard said, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If any time I wanted embarrassing facts, I mean, it's not the case that we're intentionally trying to embarrass the subject when doing social science research. But it's always going to be the case that to learn anything about individual behavior, some form of invasion of their privacy is going to be necessary. The question is whether it's justified. Well, this seems far too stringent. So what Pinkard notes is that let's change this. Is there a way in which we can change this criteria to make it possible to do social science research so that there is still some legitimate research while ruling out the more offensive types of research, the more offensive types of invasions? Alternate criteria. As mentioned previously, criteria 1 was unjustifiably strict. And so Pinkard says, well, possibly with slight change we can find criteria that would be more suitable to social science research, to preserving research. And here's the second sort of criteria. Problems with C2. As I mentioned before, the second criteria gives an exception to invasions of privacy, providing that certain conditions would be met. And I mentioned briefly that some of those conditions might be because the importance of the research overrides the individual or individuals' right to privacy. Now, the problem Pinkard has for this, with this sort of condition, or with C2, is that it trades rights for utility. Now, you might ask, well, why does this matter? Well, if the utility we can get from certain science research is great enough, isn't that a good enough trade-off for rights? Well, to put this in context, Pinkard is a rights theorist. Pinkard is saying that individuals have rights and a right to privacy. And to violate that right, you can't do it simply because other people are made better off. In fact, it's the nature of rights that they are often inefficient, that they don't maximize utility. So there are many times in society when we allow people to speak. Unpopular groups, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan, may speak at a rally. We may grant them the right to assemble, to have speeches. This requires us to hire extra security. This happened one time in Columbus where the Ku Klux Klan, approximately 12 members of the Ku Klux Klan, wanted to hold a rally on the State House steps. They were granted the right to assemble and to make their speeches, but it required putting up fences, hiring extra guards, having cleanup crews, and so forth for the 150 or 200 people that came out to protest. So this was a very expensive proposition. In fact, we could have saved a lot of money by simply saying, no, what you have to say is completely worthless and we're not going to allow you to speak. But when you value rights, what you have to do is sometimes say, even though these rights are inefficient, they don't maximize utility, they're still worthy of protection. And so Pinkard is starting out with the assumption that we have a right to privacy. Well, if you're going to have a right to privacy, then that right can only be sacrificed for the protection of a competing right. So it may be the case that my right to privacy can be overridden by someone else's right not to be harmed. That's a possibility. It's possible that my right to privacy may be overridden by someone's right to free speech. Now, I'm not sure, could make up all sorts of scenarios of why this would be popular, or how this would be possible. But his main point is that whenever a social scientist says, yes, but there will be a lot we'll get from this, it's valuable information that will help a number of people. Well, unless those people have a right to, or the social scientist has a right to that information, or that thing, again, the justified claim to whatever X is, then we can't trade that off, unless there's some sort of claim, another rights claim. So, both C1 and C2 apply to situations in which there is not consent to the individual. So we want to be clear about that as well. When we're talking about invading someone's right to privacy, we're saying, one, we can't trade rights for utility. Rights by their very nature, as Ronald Dworkin said, are trumps. They trump utility in many cases, like the free speech example. Rights can only be sacrificed for the protection of competing rights. If I have a right, you can't simply sacrifice it for something else other than another right. And both C1 and C2 are criteria that are applying when we're going in and getting information from people that we haven't asked for. Presumably, if I can respect your autonomy and your privacy by asking you if it's okay if I violate your privacy in some way. In other words, I get your permission. So Pinkard isn't concerned about those cases. Pinkard isn't saying, well, you've gotten the permission of someone and now you're going to take private information. Obviously, there's no moral problem there. What he's concerned about are those situations in which some sort of consent hasn't been received from the participant. Safe areas of social life. According to Pinkard, this privacy, the centrality of privacy, is useful because it allows us to carve out sort of a space within society that's all our own. And that space, Pinkard, is more than just sort of a personal space to look at our conceptions of the good life, but he also believes it's a place where justice, or it's a component of social justice. So he says, it is necessary for social justice in the institution of morality that what may be called safe areas of social life be carved out that are almost entirely free from intrusion. So for Pinkard, any sort of violation of that safe space is going to require some sort of justification beyond this is useful. So violation of safe areas by lying, deception, etc. is almost always wrong. And safe areas can only be overridden to protect other safe areas. So essentially, he's giving a different sort of view of this notion of rights. When we talk about our rights and our ability to do what we want, we think, well, that's part of our autonomy. But he also thinks it's a social justice question, that everyone's entitled to this area of their life where no one can invade for any reason. And when he says there are legitimate invasions, it only has to be because, or these are only justified because it's necessary to protect other safe areas. Privacy and social science research. Building on this notion of the safe area, according to Pinkard, social science research that invades a safe area is always morally unjustified. Now again here we want to make a clarification. Pinkard is talking about violations of safe areas, or violations of privacy more generally, when there's no consent of the person. Invasions of privacy in tacit, structured, and consensual situations is permissible. So what he's appealing to here is agreement of rational person standards. So I can give my agreement to you invading my privacy in a number of ways. I can actually outright consent to the invasion, so I can give you the information or allow you to give me, say, some sort of test that might give that information to you. And that might be, you might simply ask me, for the information? Or would you allow me to invade your privacy in some way? Although we probably wouldn't put it that way, but would you answer certain very personal questions? Tacit consent, or implicit consent, is consent that I give by actually partaking of a study. I give it through my actions, not necessarily words. So, for instance, if you see that there's the psychology department is looking for test subjects, you know going in that they could be testing for any number of things. So let's say they're saying we're testing for attributes of human behavior. Well, they might say, can you tell me more? No, we're sorry, we can't. Well, you have a choice by staying with the study, collecting the $50 or whatever it is they're giving these days for those sorts of things. You're tacitly agreeing to giving up certain information. So in both cases, I'm not tricking you into becoming a test subject. I'm not telling you that once you're a test subject, I'm not going to try to get personal information. So I'm not making you think that I'm not going after information about you, much like the Milgram experiment. Remember, those subjects didn't think they were the ones being studied. So if you consent to the invasion, or if there's some sort of tacit consent, if it's not actual consent, it's tacit consent. There's one other form of consent. Structured and consensual situations is permissible. There are times when we can appeal to the rational person standards. Now, rational persons we may think of as actually consenting or tacitly consenting, but there's another form of consent called hypothetical consent. And this is sort of an after-the-fact consent, a consent that you would have agreed to an invasion of privacy. And we'll talk a little bit about this third option Pinkard says there is for social science researchers. So according to Pinkard, not all social science has to be thrown out. It's just that some form of consent has to be obtained before you can start collecting information. Hypothetical agreement. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the third form of consent, which is implied by the notion of rational persons, a rational person standard, is what we call hypothetical agreement. As Pinkard notes, our judgments in these cases thus should be set in the context of a model of moral reasoning that focuses on principles that are shared between people and to which we can imagine people contractually agreeing. So hypothetical agreement is much like, in fact this is a direct appeal, to a Rawlsian sort of contract situation. If you were in the original position and didn't know if you were going to be the test subject, would you agree with an invasion of privacy of whatever type we're discussing? So when we look at a particular situation and we're asking ourselves, was this a violation of someone's privacy? The question we could ask is, would we have agreed to this had we been given the option to contractually agree, to give our consent, whether tacitly or actually? So one way to think of this is the following. Imagine I'm on campus and one of those traveling shows that comes around every once in a while with games and things sponsored by various events. And let's say I go up to the Xbox 360 display and it turns out that I win an Xbox for myself and one of my named friends, provided that I give their name, address, phone number, email address, and so forth. Now, imagine I say, well, I'm going to take my game, but I'm sorry, I'm going to give up my other game. Why? Well, because I haven't gotten the consent of my friend to give away their personal information. And imagine maybe they wanted something more than just, maybe wanted the birth date on top of it. So our regular name, address, phone number, email address, birth date, age, I guess that would be implicit in there, and, things of that sort, married, single, the standard sort of thing you see on a questionnaire. But you were thinking, well, I'm not sure whether my friend would actually want me to reveal that information. Now, you can also imagine that I take this back and show my friend, look what I won, an Xbox 360, and actually I won a second one, but it turns out I couldn't actually give it to you because I didn't want to violate your privacy. Now, we can also imagine our friend saying to us, what are you, crazy? Of course you can give that information. That's not something I care about. You know I don't care about that stuff. I mean, I understand in principle you shouldn't give away personal information about someone, that this is my private information, but this is a free Xbox. That's sort of what we're talking about with hypothetical. If you know your friend well enough, and if you knew that your friend would rather have the new Xbox, rather than worrying about whether someone knows their email address or their phone number or their age, then you could say that they hypothetically have agreed to disclosing that information. You know them well enough. You know what their values are. You know what their views are well enough to have said you would have agreed to give up that information had you been there yourself. And so hypothetical agreement does in fact rest on a respect for persons, because it's respecting those persons' views and values. Of course, this is a very difficult sort of agreement, because we never know for sure what someone is going to think. In a Rawlsian hypothetical situation, in the original position, we're imagining what contractors would agree to. But those are hypothetical. They're not real people. So it becomes a little more difficult to determine when it's acceptable for me to violate someone's privacy based on this hypothetical notion. So, for instance, I might say that someone would agree to have their privacy violated when the study is done in public, when they're doing things that they do openly in the public eye. And you might say, even though they've not agreed to be studied, anything they're doing out in public, they've implicitly, tacitly, or would have agreed to allow me to study in that sort of case, because they know that this is a public sphere and they can't expect any privacy in certain public realms. But hypothetical agreement is the third, although tricky way of sort of figuring out whether consent would have been granted. And Pinkard says that this is a legitimate way of doing social science research, although it is going to be difficult to determine when we actually have a hypothetical agreement, because hypothetical agreements are about as good as the paper they're written on, which means they aren't written on any paper. There is no actual agreement. So that's the hypothetical agreement section. We'll talk a little more about this in the next slide, because hypothetical agreements are heavily dependent on the context in which the agreement takes place. Context counts. One of the things we want to ask, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is whether or not hypothetical agreement actually counts as agreement. So we can think of a number of situations which may or may not sort of have hypothetical agreement attached to them for the agent. So is the laboratory setting a poker game? Going back to one of our previous chapters, can we assume that when you walk into a laboratory, particularly one in the social science or psychology, that you understand you're entering a game with its own set of rules, that you may or may not be the subject of the game, that by agreeing to partake in the study, you're agreeing to information possibly being collected about yourself? If it's true that that context, the laboratory, becomes like the poker game, then it's understood that normal rules of morality don't apply, that deception could be part of the game. And so many people would argue that the minute you sign up for a laboratory sort of experiment, within certain limits, you know that it's possible that you're the subject. And so you have a choice. You can either not go into the study, saying I don't want to take the chance of some private information being revealed, or you can say I'm willing to play that game. That's fine. In the laboratory setting, they've guaranteed anonymity as far as all the data goes, so I'm not actually concerned about that. So even if private information is disclosed, it's going to remain confidential. I'm willing to play the poker game. It's less clear in other contexts. Is the subway a poker game? I believe it was in your text. Many studies have been done about how people will react to what happens to someone else. So social scientists have had people fake heart attacks in a subway. And what they found is that a number of people will simply stand by while someone literally dies right in front of them. And so what some would argue is that when I go onto a subway, I don't expect to be part of a social experiment. On the other hand, some would argue that in a social setting, if someone's having a heart attack, the question is, what would I do? Well, that's a public realm. I've chosen within the public realm to sort of disclose a characteristic of myself. That is, that I'm not a particularly helpful person. So even though the person is faking the heart attack, which might obviously be deceptive, the question is, well, you're in public and you didn't know that the person was faking it, so you've disclosed information that you would have disclosed anyway had it been a real situation. What would hypothetical agents agree to or not agree to? Is what I mentioned in the previous slide. The problem with hypothetical agents and hypothetical agreements is that we're not always sure what a hypothetical, that is not real person, would actually agree or not agree to. It's a little easier when we're talking about someone we know, But if we're doing social science research, we're obviously depending upon a general notion of a rational agent or general individual, everyday individual, and asking ourselves, what would they agree to had they been given the opportunity? And so that becomes very difficult for hypothetical agreement. We don't know what hypothetical agents would agree to because we sort of have to characterize those agents. So it's sort of making up what they would do. Now, we may have good reason for thinking they would do some things and not others, but that does cause some problem. Is there a right to do research that overrides one's right to privacy? And what Pinkard says essentially is no, that the researcher doesn't have a right. So regardless of how we solve the consent problem, it's still a problem. The social science research can't simply override the right to privacy, can't just simply shrug it off and say, well, those are difficult things, I can't get consent, I'm going to have to invade privacy because I have a right to do my research. Well, according to Pinkard, you don't have that right. And these are the sort of problems we have to grapple with in the social science fields, is how do we get consent to do research given that the researcher doesn't have a right to do research? They don't have a right to violate privacy for their own ends, which again would be sort of a utility sort of argument. The researcher can either make two claims. I have a right that overrides your right, or the utility of what I'm collecting overrides your right. We've already eliminated utility overriding rights. And so the question is, does someone have a right to do research? And I think most people will think that no, in fact, research is not a right, particularly when it involves violating someone else's privacy.